Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is the Person You Want to Be podcast. I am your host, Eric Teplitz. Today, we're going to be steeped in the philosophical life. I'm very privileged to have with me as my special guest today, Scott Samuelson. Scott Samuelson is a teacher, philosopher, and essayist, the author of The Deepest Human Life, An Introduction to Philosophy for Everyone, and 7 Ways of Looking at Pointless Suffering. He's the winner of the Hiett Prize in the Humanities for his work in bringing philosophy to the public. Among his many essays and articles, Why I Teach Plato to Plumbers in The Atlantic has been widely circulated. He's taught the humanities in universities, colleges, prisons, houses of worship, and bars. On top of his regular job as a professor at Kirkwood Community College in Iowa, he works with the Catherine Project, where experienced teachers engage great books with a small group of readers for free. He's currently finishing his next book, Rome as a Guide to the Good Life, a philosophical grand tour. Scott Samuelson, welcome to the Person You Want to Be.
Hey, it's my privilege and honor to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. So, in your first book, The Deepest Human Life, fairly early on, you give us what I consider your sort of superhero origin story, which was when you stumbled upon Thomas Aquinas. And I want to get to that. But before we do, I'm interested if you could just provide us with something of a snapshot of your childhood, what that looked like, the environment you grew up in, and also if there were any, early notions as a youngster that you had when you envisioned yourself as a grown-up, and what, who the person you thought you wanted to be might have been back then.
Well, yeah, that's it's an interesting thing I've reflected on a lot, actually. I grew up in a very small town in Iowa, a town of about 500 people if you count the dogs. And and it was at the turn of the 20th century, long before I was born. The town had once been a fairly booming Iowa town because the railroad went through it, and so there had been a opera house and various stores and churches. But by the time I was growing up there, all of that stuff had long ago collapsed, and so even the downtown was like a ghost town in some ways. So I kind of grew up. The way I've been writing this thing on Rome, and I kind of think of it as like I kind of grew up in the ruins, in some sense of an Iowa town. But I have to say that small town I think was good for my philosophical education, so to speak, because there's a way in which when you're in a small town, you see all of human life with a face, sometimes in the big city, you can kind of get lost in anonymity, but here, like, you kind of see everything up close and personal. My first aspiration as a child, when I think I was about 3 or 4 years old, was to be a garbage man. I remember seeing the garbage men jump onto the back of the garbage truck and thinking that seemed pretty cool. But shortly thereafter that, I framed a desire to be a comic book artist. I love comics, and I used to like to draw a lot. And then that kind of transitioned into thinking about just being a visual artist more generally. But as you said, when I was about 16 years old, I was in the Iowa City Public Library. Iowa City was like the big city for us, still relatively small town by most people's standards. But I was in the public library there, and I stumbled across a book that contained various philosophical things, and among them were the 5 Proofs of God from Thomas Aquinas. And I read those, and I didn't really fully understand what they were all about, but I was like, whatever this guy's doing, I want to be doing something like that.
And literally, I mean, in hindsight, it seems like your destiny was shaped in that moment, would you say?
Yeah, actually, in a weird way, it really was. I mean, it's funny how we have these moments sometimes where a lot is crammed into that single moment. And so, yeah, in this sense, I did feel as if a destiny was kind of looking out in front of me. And what was so strange for me at least, when I think back on it, is like I said, I had no clue what philosophy was. Like I said, I didn't even really understand what he was doing. I mean, the proofs were to me quite complicated and strange, but just somehow the whole idea of a human mind reflecting on really big questions like God, and doing it at such a kind of an interesting way, I thought, wow, that's what seems like people should be doing. That's what I want to be doing. And so, without even really knowing what philosophy was, I wanted to be a philosopher.
You wanted in. Do you have any, maybe even a visual memory of what it was that attracted you to that book? Because it seems like such an unlikely thing to stumble upon. Was it a proximity issue? Was it like on display somewhere? Was it, how did you find it?
Yeah, I think it was on it was on, like they must have had a shelf of books, and when one was just sort of set out there, and I can't even remember the title. It was something like, Masterpieces of Western Philosophy or something like that. And I just kind of picked it up and leafed through it, and then and indeed there came across that, and I was like, 5 proofs of God? I mean, the idea of 1 proof of God seemed to be quite astonishing, and then 5 of them. So that's what lured me in.
Do you remember at that age what your perception of God was? Like going, when you walked into the library at age 16, did you have a conception of God?
Yeah, I did. Well, sort of. This was another kind of interesting thing. I mean, I grew up, as I said, in a small town, and at one time there had been both a Presbyterian and Methodist church that were fully supported, but like, again, by the time I'd grown up there, the population had so dwindled that they consolidated the 2 churches. But some of the older parishioners really insisted on their identity as either Presbyterians or Methodists. But growing up there, like, I didn't have any clue what the difference was. It just seemed kind of generic Protestant Christianity. But I mean, I did. My parents did take me to church every Sunday, and so I did have a kind of sense of God. Though that was strange too, because I remember feeling like the kind of sense of God that was given us in church was fairly bland, and kind of benign, kind of like, Mr. Nice Guy in the sky. But then at the same time, we'd have Bible readings once in a while, and the Bible always struck me as much stranger, as if, this is a much more ferocious image of the divine. And so, I think I had a kind of confused sense of God. I mean, like I said, I'd kind of gotten these messages from the Bible that seemed to me quite bizarre and exotic and strange, and then this kind of more mundane vision of God. And though I had always sort of professed belief in God, it was when I read those proofs that I actually almost had the feeling like that I no longer believed in God after having read the proofs. I'm not saying that was the right conclusion or a good conclusion overall, but all of a sudden the idea that if the human mind could be proving God, then somehow the human mind was more, I don't know, more fundamental for us. So, I mean, like I said, that's not necessarily where I've ended up in my life overall, but that was part of the journey was, how do you relate to these big questions, including the divine?
Right. And I'm sure as a philosophy professor, people are asking you all the time what you actually believe. And we're going to keep the mystique a little bit. I'm not going to go there.
Well, that is what I say to my students when they ask me these kinds of questions, like, do you believe in God or whatever it is? I actually use that very kind of language. I always say I like to keep a little mystery, in part because I don't want to shut down their own kind of philosophical journeys. I don't want to give them a feeling that there's some shortcut that they can take, to their own views.
Or that, you have all the answers, right? And whatever you believe is quote, correct, right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And actually in kind of in the long run, belief, sometimes I wonder if maybe that's not that even important in a way. There's some other things that perhaps are more important for us than what we happen to believe.
Like what?
Well, maybe like what we do.
Yeah, yeah,
like how we act, like how we treat people,
sure.
And even our openness to things. I mean, to believe in something, one way or the other is in a sense to shut off the possibilities
everything else
that the other side represents. And so sometimes I'm not trying to say that belief is bad. I'm just simply saying that it's good to have other things than beliefs, and even with regard to your beliefs, it's sometimes good to have a kind of, I don't know, willingness to explore for the sake of your well-being overall. So like things like action, judgment, openness, curiosity, sometimes those are more important to me than just what you happen to believe.
That's great. You've talked about William James a lot in pretty much everything that I encounter associated with you. I know that you consider him a personal hero. And, he's known, among other things, as being, quote, the father of American psychology. So I have a couple of questions related to William James. First of all, why is he a personal hero of yours, if not the personal hero? And second, what, in your estimation, is the relationship between psychology and philosophy?
Yeah. In terms of William James himself, when I got around to reading him, I just loved reading him. I mean, that was my number one thing. He's such a wonderful stylist, and I mean that not just in the sense that he writes well, though that's true, but that he kind of brings a whole human sensibility to bear on whatever he's doing, and it comes across so vividly. And to me, that's a real model of what philosophy could be, not just some kind of cold, abstract thing, but something that really felt infused with our humanity and with our lives and with a real concern for others. And so I just, that to me, I just really, really admired about him as that whole approach he brought to philosophy. And of course, I liked it too, that he's an American, someone that feels close in a way to me. I mean, I admire many philosophers from very distant periods and places as well, but there's something nice about having someone who's speaking in an American tone that I admired, and I just liked that his conception of philosophy was a sense of what really mattered to people, and trying to understand that. He wrote essays that he called, essays in popular philosophy, meaning philosophy that people could actually
digest,
grasp, and digest and deal with exactly. And to me, I thought, well, that seems important. I mean, there may be a really important place for a more academic, so to speak, ivory tower kind of philosophy, and I've learned a lot from it. But it seems to me if it's really going to be worth something, it should be worth something in the context of real lives, including one's own and others. And so that idea of communicating it in ways that were vivid and spoke to people, that I really admired in him, and so he kind of served as a hero in that regard. In terms of psychology and philosophy, it's a great question, and I don't know that I have any perfect answer, but it does. The thing that I like in James, in his approach both to psychology and philosophy, and actually this even goes, I suppose, in a way to what we were just talking about with belief. He has a kind of famous book called Varieties of Religious Experience, and so rather than try to prove or disprove God or something like that, James says, well, let's look at how people actually experience the religious life. And that comes in various varieties. And so let's kind of look at, so to speak, the psychology of how people relate to these things, because that's going to give us a kind of self-knowledge, a kind of insight. And he recognizes that people have different sensibilities, people experience things in different ways. And so to try to kind of understand those things, on the one hand, you can kind of learn something about yourself. You're like, oh, I kind of see things like that rather than like that. But in a way, you can also sort of enlarge yourself by looking at the spectrum of human psychology. You can realize that while maybe you lean more in this direction, there are these other voices that you might have also in yourself. Maybe they're not as prominent, but you can kind of amplify or draw on some of their strengths that way. So, I mean, I think James was just interested in the human mind and how people experience things, and it made him a very acute psychologist. But I think it also really played a role in his idea of how philosophy can be meaningful to people.
So in The Deepest Human Life, once again, your first book, An Introduction to Philosophy for Everyone, you mentioned that William James once defined philosophy as, quote, the unusually stubborn attempt to think clearly, unquote, which I think is wonderful. Obviously, the, philosophy, the etymology of the word essentially means a love of wisdom. But I think there's also an important distinction that I've come across in your books as well, which is, that philosophy is not a dispensing of wisdom, it's a search for wisdom. So then a philosopher is not necessarily a purveyor of wisdom, but a person who is constantly aspiring toward wisdom. And that, I think, I think that would qualify, most thinking people as philosophers, would you say?
Yeah, no, I actually do have that sense that I believe that philosophy is just a natural part of being human. Obviously, some people are going to really devote themselves to it in the way that I've tried to, but I really think that everyone has that quality in them. They ask philosophical questions, even really young children. In fact, maybe especially young children. Ask fundamental questions, wonder about them, and try to figure out what's going on. And in that sense, children are philosophers. And I think we all kind of continue that, though we sometimes have a tendency to try to shut down that part of us. And I see kind of one of the jobs of a teacher of philosophy or a writer of philosophy, try to turn that back on or turn it up a bit, in people. So yeah, I do think that. And I do like to emphasize, as you have nicely done, this idea that philosophy is about the love of wisdom. I like to really emphasize the love part. It is not just someone with all the answers. And in fact, I don't even really want to be someone with all the answers. But this idea of kind of constantly returning to things and thinking about them and thinking how, what they can mean for us and exploring new possibilities. All of that, I think, is enriching in itself. I mean, Socrates famously says that the unexamined life is not worth living. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but I would definitely say that the examined life is very much worth living. It adds a kind of value to be thinking about these things, searching for answers, sometimes finding something of an answer, but then always being open to continue on that search. That's kind of how I see the love of wisdom.
You talk about children as kind of being natural philosophers. I know you're a dad, so it just, to me, it begs the question, like, little do these kids know when they're, very young, that dad happens to be, devoting his life to philosophy. He's a writer, he's a teacher. But to them, you're just dad. So I can't help but wonder what kinds of, what kinds of questions did your kids ask you growing up in terms of, the big questions? How did they present them to you? And how did you, how did you integrate or even maybe distinguish your roles as philosopher versus dad when you tried answering these questions to your kids? And obviously at different ages, right? Because you're probably going to answer them differently at different stages of their development.
Yeah, it's a tricky question about being a philosopher and a parent, actually. I mean, there's certain things that make it, as a kind of, it's fascinating to be a philosopher and to have children because you do get to engage with them at that level. And I really love that. I mean, I remember just from very early on, like my daughter asking me, like, what happens to, she had a pet die and she was like, what happens to, where did its soul go, or what happens, and and I tried to engage her, and she was like, I don't think so. Like, I have different ideas about it, So I kind of loved that back and forth and that refusal to take my authority seriously, either as a dad or a philosopher.
Did you ever panic?
But yeah,
did you ever panic at any of those questions? Like, oh, how do I, like, oh my goodness, what do I say?
Well, yeah, I mean, because this is what I mean about, like, you have to think about, when do you ever have to switch from philosopher to dad? I mean, you can be philosopher dad, but is there any time you have to sort of be like, look, now it's just time to be dad and assert one's authority? I mean, one of the things that kids like to do is a very philosophical thing of always ask why. And philosophers do that same thing. And so I can kind of enjoy going down that path, but maybe there are times in which one just needs to say, look,
Shut it down.
enough with the why, we need to get back to work, or you just need to do it because that too is important. So sometimes it's hard to figure out the balance of that kind of stuff.
I have a memory of being at a graduation party. I don't remember if it was a high school or college graduation party. It was a pool party, and I was engaged in conversation with with the father of the person who was hosting the party. And we got into this conversation about how important it is to understand why something happens. And I was very much of the opinion that understanding why is really important, because how else can we then improve, and how else can we attempt to understand and make better decisions and that so forth. And he presented this sort of refutation to that kind of stunned me. He said the whys and he said it, as if this were just obvious fact. He said the whys in life don't matter. And I said, how can you say that? Of course they matter, for all the reasons I was just mentioning. And I've thought about that. I mean, still, I still think about that comment he made. And I feel like I understand it a lot better now that I'm probably around the age he was when he said it. And I think what he probably meant by that was that ultimately why something is not nearly as important as the fact that it is. You have to deal with reality as it is. And why it happened, we're in this situation, for instance, like with COVID. Why, again, that youthful part of me still says, yeah, it's important to understand if we want to try to prevent further pandemics, if we want to handle the next one better than we did this one, then the whys are important. But the reality is that we have to deal with this, that it presents it presents profound problems and challenges that have to be dealt with. And as far as the dealing with them goes, the why is not relevant. So I don't know. I find that,
Yeah. This is part of, to me, what philosophy does do, though, is it kind of has to shuttle back and forth between, so to speak, the why, the attempt to explain and understand, but then also the attempt to just recognize the fact of things and stand sometimes in awe of them, or live in relationship to them. I mean, like there's a line of poetry from a German mystic from the medieval period, that is, the rose is without why, it blooms because it blooms. And there is some truth to that sometimes when we really find what makes us flourish, it can just be without why. It can be without reason. And you're just happy it is. You're just happy to live within that. But sometimes we're not living within that, just, inner flourishing. And there it seems to me that sometimes seeking out some of the why, or asking why, can sometimes help us to get, refined those things.
That's interesting.
In us.
Yeah, because the context really does matter, right? Because sometimes asking why is extremely helpful, and in other times it might actually be harmful. So I'm thinking of, interviews that I've heard with musicians, and especially popular musicians. And, critics are always analyzing to death lyrics and music, and what was your process of, what were you considering? There's this great quote. I'm a diehard Beatles fan. It's probably impossible for me to have a conversation without them coming up, or nearly impossible. And I remember someone presented to John Lennon in the early days of the Beatles, or maybe he was reading a review, and the critic was appreciating his use of an Aeolian cadence at the end of a song. And Lennon is like, what the hell is that? Like, is that some kind of bird? And so I think sometimes musicians get annoyed with this sort of analyzing of what it is they do, and other artists too. They do it and they don't want to overthink it, because it might even interfere with the creative process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think that's often true, and I do, but again, it's like the way I think of these things is in terms of, I'll use a musical metaphor, in terms of rhythm. I mean, I think we have to find our kind of rhythm, and things kind of have their rhythm. So, like I think with music, part of the the rhythm for most musicians is there are times in which they really do have to turn on a certain part of their brain and will to, practice and to try to, figure out how to get it right or whatever. But then there's also a time to let all that go and just to play, just to have that kind of, to just tap into the music, to tap into the muses. And I think that that's true in life too. I mean, like I said, there are definitely times where we just have to kind of, we want to get to that ability to I don't know, live a little more freely and just kind of flourish in and of ourselves. But sometimes we got to work at that a bit to get to that moment where that's possible.
Like the preparation almost. It could be considered even sometimes the preparation for it. If you put in the time and honed your chops, you're then more available to the muse.
Right. Exactly.
So getting back to your youth, so you're captured by the philosophical life on this fateful day at age 16 in the public library, and did you have it in mind as a profession, or were you starting to entertain because you're getting to the age where you're thinking about college? And coming from such a small town, was it unusual to have the sort of intellectual appetite that you had and desire to study, go into academia? Was that how did that sit with your peer group and just kind of your environment that you were growing up in? Was it expected of you that you would go to college or not?
It was probably expected of me that I would go to college. It wasn't expected of people necessarily generally that they would all go to college. And I kind of stood out, particularly by the time I was 16, as a bit of a weirdo in the context of my small town. And at some level, I just embraced that and it didn't really bother me one way or the other. But I certainly felt at odds overall with the overall peer group of my high school. Less so. I feel that way less so now, but back then I sort of embraced, like I said, my unique identity in that regard. And so, I kind of wanted to leave it all behind and go off and see the world in a new way. I feel kind of blessed, and I'm not quite sure to what extent this is generational or partly my parents, but I didn't feel a lot of pressure on me I wasn't thinking like, what are you going to do with that? I wasn't thinking, what kind of job are you going to do? I was just sort of like, I love this. I want to keep pursuing it, and I suppose at some point along the line, I thought, well, I guess I could, be a professor or something. But it wasn't as if those thoughts just weren't foremost my mind when I was 16, and even when I was in college and majoring in philosophy, there was I felt a kind of really blessed freedom to just pursue the things I was interested in. I feel very lucky about that. I mean, it's not that I didn't think about money and all that. I didn't have a ton of money, and I knew that sometimes I had to get a job or something, but it didn't. Sometimes I feel like I worry that a lot of kids now are really brainwashed, so to speak, to think that everything has to be step by step and it all leads to some kind of,
money
job or something. Yeah, money. And I don't think that that's a healthy way of being at all. And certainly not a healthy way of approaching your education, that somehow it's just, getting skills or whatever to prepare you for the work world. That just doesn't seem like a very human way of approaching things.
How did you settle on Grinnell College?
Well, I mean, I applied to a few places. I didn't have some really highly developed sense of good colleges, bad universities, that sort of thing. And I knew that Grinnell College in Iowa, liberal arts college, was good, and I got a really nice scholarship to it. So, that was attractive to me, and I really loved being there. I loved that liberal arts environment of studying literature and history and philosophy and science and math, and so it felt right, and it proved to be a good fit for me.
You obviously thrived there. You ended up valedictorian of your graduating class, so I assume it was a positive experience. Do you remember how your parents felt about, I mean, here you get a scholarship. It's kind of hard to argue with that. Did your parents have any feeling one way or another about your choice of major, or were they concerned for you about, as parents, often understandably are, about your future, and in terms of a profession, or did they give you a kind of a long leash with that?
They gave me a pretty long leash, and I mean, I think I think they had a um, pretty good sense for how to deal with it. I mean, on the one hand, they wanted me to do what I was passionate about and get a good education because they thought that was just good for a human being to have and will serve me well no matter what I do. And I think they were right about that. And I think they also did sort of, think like, look, well, you do have to be responsible for yourself too, which means you will have to, get work and take care of business. But like I said, they didn't necessarily say, so therefore you should only study the things that will help you to get a job. They were like, get a good education, and then you got to be a responsible human being. And they were happy, as long as I seemed to be flourishing in those contexts. And like I said, I think I admire them for that.
And so you graduate from Grinnell. Was it a foregone conclusion that you were going to pursue more school, or what went into the decision to then pursue a master's and or doctorate?
It was pretty much a foregone conclusion at some point, though. Again, like I said, I felt a kind of, like I said, very blessed freedom about this, where all of a sudden, I think it was my senior year, beginning of my senior year, and I'm like, what should I do? I guess maybe I should apply to graduate school, But I did want to continue to study philosophy, and I knew that this was the kind of thing that, if I really wanted to be serious about it, it meant I needed to keep working at it, and that I wanted to work at it with people that I felt could really help me. And so graduate school felt like a pretty natural next step. I will say even at that point, though, and even once I was in graduate school, I didn't necessarily think I was going to be a professor, though I thought maybe I might be. Again, I went to graduate school. Luckily, I had a scholarship again, and so it gave me the kind of freedom to just say, I'm going to pursue this because this is what I want to learn, and I seem to be growing as a human being.
I love it. Yeah. And, I'm always curious about this idea of like a professional philosopher. I'm wondering if you could speak to what that even is. And also, like, when you read about philosophers, as it were, like, ancient philosophers and people who are known to us today for being, quote, philosophers. It's like, well, they were people and they had occupations and they came from all different sorts of walks of life. But this label of philosopher is an interesting one. At least to me, it's always been an interesting one. Like, in other words, can you be a philosopher without being a writer? Can you be a philosopher without being a teacher? Do those come with the territory? Is that part of the definition of being a, quote, professional philosopher? What are your thoughts on you can riff off of any of what I just said?
Yeah, well, they're great questions you're asking, and I think this. My first thing that I really do want to emphasize is that I like I said, I think that really people can be philosophers or engage in philosophy. You don't have to necessarily write. You don't have to necessarily teach. Though you probably will do those things at some level in one's life. I mean, they might take different forms. They might not be like you're teaching in a classroom or something, but in all likelihood, it will involve engaging with people in some ways, and that will prove instructive. I mean, the funny thing about, say, like Socrates as a philosopher was that, he didn't see his work as like telling people what to think, instructing them in that way, but by engaging them in conversation, they were both, so to speak, learning together. And that maybe is one of the most profound ways of teaching. But anyway, so I think that's important, that I don't see philosophy as something that is a profession per se at all. It's just something one is, and can cultivate in oneself, in the same way that, like, being a musician, you don't have to be a professional to be a musician. In fact, you just got to play music,
Yeah.
and it is a kind of natural thing for people to do. Um, I also feel, honestly, I've always had a little bit of misgivings about the idea of a professional philosopher. I mean, if you go back to, as you said, to the ancient philosophers, many of them eschewed the idea of being paid at all. They thought, like, look, this is a kind of gift that has to be done. It's part of the kind of the generosity of human life that one engages in it. And I do kind of feel that way, as you mentioned in the introduction. I work at this thing now called the Catherine Project, where we're trying to just teach for free. People just want to learn, and I've volunteered in prisons, and I've just taught in other kinds of venues for free, and I do that just because I love doing it, and actually I have sometimes my best experiences in those environments when the kind of money thing has been taken out, and it's just simply, hey, I just want to engage in this
I
stuff.
love that.
Hey, so do
in
I.
a way, that's kind of more pure, isn't it? Like that's pure philosophy, because it's completely
Yeah.
like money be damned, or prestige be damned. It's doing philosophy for philosophy's sake.
Yeah, exactly. And I do feel like, I mean, sometimes I like to joke that, like, I teach even in college for free. I just get paid to attend meetings and grade. And I do kind of feel that way, that, like, I want to enter a zone where it's no longer about money, where it's about just the thing itself. And obviously there are complicated issues about this. I mean, the question of how you get your money is a very serious question, and I feel very lucky that I do get some money for doing what I'm doing, but I don't want to get so attached to the money that I forget that this activity would be worth doing under any circumstances, even if we fire all philosophy teachers and shut down all philosophy departments, and
Please let's
no
hope
one
that
ever
doesn't
makes
happen.
any
By the
money.
way, please let's not.
Well, yeah, me too. And it's something we should be proud of as a country, that we have invested somewhat in the liberal arts and in things like philosophy, and that I think that's something to be proud of. And I worry that we're sort of losing that thought, that's something to be to sort of take historical pride in. Not everyone throughout the history of time has invested in that way in things. So I think that's a wonderful thing. But I'm just simply saying, when push comes to shove, it is something that I think really should be done, for free. It's something that's done outside at least just the mere economy of things. I mean, you were talking about musicians earlier too. It's like, I feel like they sort of feel this way too, for the most part. I mean, obviously you want to get paid, and
the musical analogy,
and you want it, whatever.
Yeah, the musical analogy of what you just said is, so many musicians say this is, I play for free. They pay me to travel, be in hotels and airports and all of that. But the 2 hours on stage is like, yeah.
Right. Yeah, and that's what makes it so. So that's where, again, it's kind of like the roses without why it blooms because it blooms. I mean, that's where you're getting to that just pure flourishing as a human being.
So you're a grad student at Emory University on scholarship. Did you know right from the get-go you were going to pursue a doctorate, or did you start off in a master's program?
The way our program was set up was that it was meant to get a PhD. So you happened to get a master's, and you could opt out at that point. But the idea of entering the program, there may have been a few exceptions to this, but for the most part, that was the intention. Program.
Yeah. So, and what was the subject of your dissertation?
My dissertation was called "The Ancient Quarrel Between Poetry and Philosophy." So Plato in the Republic, the character of Socrates in Plato's Republic, makes this kind of comment at one point that there's an old quarrel between poets and philosophers. And so I was interested in what he meant by that and the legacy of that. But I have to say that throughout my entire career as a philosopher, I never really wanted to see myself as a specialist. I mean, that is a kind of, I think, academic a little bit of a deformation of philosophy, is to just be like, well, I just do 19th century, German philosophy or something. I mean, it's fine to have some specialties like that, and it's certainly great that there are scholars who really preserve texts or and do that kind of thing. But to me, in a way, philosophies can't really just be boxed in. It wants to, be open to the entire history of thinking as its conversation.
Yeah, and there's also a tension, right, between academic philosophy that reaches, a privileged few versus philosophy for everyone, as you, use those words in the subtitle of your first book. And, I would think that tension would be alive for a lot of people who pursue philosophy, quote, professionally, because it is about living well, ultimately, and that applies to anyone and everyone, whether they are academics or not. I want to ask you, I want to sort of segue here into something that I'm curious about from having read your articles and books. I see the notion of freedom come up a lot. And I speculate that this is one of your primary values just because of the way you talk about it in different, passages and contexts. And I'm just to give the listeners and viewers here a couple of quotes to give them some context. So in the speech that you gave when you were awarded the Hiett Prize, and yes, that's actually available online, you can find it. You say, when I talk about the value of education, I take the liberal arts to mean subjects considered independently of their economic value, subjects studied for their own intrinsic merits, subjects appropriate to free people. And I'm emphasizing free there. And I want to also just to give this question a little more context about freedom. You have a TEDx talk, which by the way is excellent. Everyone listening to this, as soon as you're done, go find that online. It's really wonderful. The talk is called How Philosophy Can Save Your Life. I think it's a beautiful, beautiful talk. It's 15 or 16 minutes, and it actually might just change your life. But towards the end of the talk, you make this comment: freedom is the one thing you should never ask for. That struck me as a really profound statement. And before I even go any further, I'd like you to elaborate on that, if you would, and also to maybe more broadly answer the question how you personally define the words free, as in subjects appropriate to free people, and freedom, especially in the context of that quote, freedom is the one thing you should never ask for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are good and tough questions. So one way of conceiving of freedom is just simply to do what you want to do. And that's not quite what I mean. I think when I'm using freedom in the passages you've said, though that might have some connection to that. I worry sometimes that's our slightly misguided view of freedom is just like, well, I just want to do what I want to do. To me, what I think of freedom as is in a way, something that respects our dignity as human beings and who we fully are. Mm. And in this sense, freedom, the opposite of freedom on my sense would be slavery. That the slave is not free. The slave is being put under someone's thumb, is being dominated in a way. And we can be put under the thumb of a person. We can be put under the thumb of situations. We can be put under the thumb of even our own impulses. You think of like an addict in some sense is not free. They're under, they're being dominated in some sense by parts of their own psychology. So, to me, that idea of being free is to be, to sort of assume your best station as a human being, and to kind of get some overall sense of dignity, get some overall sense of yourself. And so that's why, like I said, if you just have an education that is about um, getting a job. So in a way, you're not particularly free. You might be free to pick this course or that course of study, but you're all doing it just so that someone will hire you or whatever, as opposed to saying these things are worth studying in and of themselves. So that's to me what the liberal arts are about, or liberal education is about, is that kind of liberating freedom to say, this is what I want to do as a human being, and I see the value of this, and I want to pursue it as such. That seems to me to be, what freedom is at its best. I mean, in the ancient world, like in the ancient Greece or even ancient Rome, they really did have these striated societies of like free people and slaves. And free people meant you were liberated to engage in politics, to think about mathematics or philosophy or do art, whereas slaves had to serve the basic purposes so that those things could happen. I would like to believe that we can work for, a society where all people are free, where we do not have to feel as if certain people have to be under other people's thumbs. And so that's, to me, part of why I think like philosophy should be for everyone, is that we all have this in us, this kind of questioning, and we see the worth of these things, and we have this kind of dignity to be thinking about it. And okay, well, you should be free like anyone else. You shouldn't be just forced into doing something, and to shut down that part of your human dignity.
Beautiful answer. And I think it inevitably brushes up against economics, right? We live in a quote free society, and yet there's always this tension about there's a pressure that you have to pay the bills, regardless of how simply you might live. And certainly there are definitely personal choices where, if you have a lifestyle that, requires huge amounts of money to finance, well, then in a way you're less free because you have to figure out how you're going to finance that style. And that's personal choice. But I think that for many people, they're brushing up against, they want to pursue what they love. They want to study what interests them. They want to be, quote, free in the sense that you're describing. And there may be opportunities to do so, certainly more so than in other cultures or countries, in the world today. But at the same time, like just the issue of student debt is that alone makes me question what freedom do people coming of age now really have if they're going to pursue an education. I mean, they're basically signing up to be indentured servants, unless they come from money or have access to, independent wealth, or are lucky enough to receive a scholarship. But it's really interesting, like here in California, they used to have a certain ethic about making schools, state schools, and even the UC system, super affordable so that almost anyone really could have access to them. And now, not only are they more expensive, especially the UC schools, they're quite prohibitively expensive for a lot of people, but the competitiveness just to get in is astounding. And even in just a generation's time, it's much, much more competitive than it ever was. So I think that these are difficult things to grapple with, but they're definitely relevant to this discussion of what it even means to live in a free society, I think.
Yeah, I do too. And I mean, I do think that for a while, California really had one of the most enviable educational situations possible, where people could go to a community college, and mostly did go to a community college at first, and then from there went to one of the greatest set of state schools, that were available, and could do all of that quite affordably. And that people kind of found their way within that in a way that benefited the people. I mean, that to me was a wonderful model of what public education could aspire to be. And it saddens me that we've kind of walked away from that. And as you say, if people, we do kind of put them in this state of feeling like indentured servants, or even, it's almost like they have to mortgage their own lives, in order to feel like they're ever going to acquire value in society. And that just seems to me we should definitely try to resist that at the political level, and fund education in a better way. But I think it behooves us all as individuals just to say, hey, I don't want to play that game like that. I got to figure out a way to keep my dignity alive in spite of all this. I mean, we all have to, work. We all have to pay our bills. We all have to do that kind of stuff. But we don't want to just have our whole identity sucked into that vortex.
Yeah, or all of our energy
really
taken up. Some people, they need to work. They need to just literally eat, sleep, and work. Like just as a matter, just as a function of surviving and getting by. And there's, for some folks, there is no, space even for anything else.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I have a bunch more questions. I want to honor your time. So, feel free to let me know if you need to stop, but I do have several more questions I'd like to ask.
Yeah, wonderful.
Okay. So I'm curious about your own, at this stage in your life, what does it look like for your own pursuit of, quote, continuing education? And I don't mean, in a professional sense, but I mean in a more of like a self-directed sense, because, I think we're both of the mindset that education is a lifelong inquiry. And so, how do you incorporate education into your life with your responsibilities as a parent, as a philosophy instructor, et cetera?
Yeah, I definitely feel that way. And I only feel, I think, fully myself when I am learning something. I mean, one of the real beauties, though, of teaching and writing is that teaching and writing are sort of just self-educational processes. So, like, for instance, I'm just working on a book on Rome, and I've been teaching, this short-term study abroad in Rome. And so for me, that whole thing of taking students to Rome, I mean, I had to learn a ton to do a good job of teaching that stuff. And there's always more to learn with regard to it. And then writing about it, okay, now I've got, I got to read up on these things and then, kind of put those things together in my own mind. And so, I find that and here's the kind of funny thing is that in a way, one is almost the best teacher when one is in the midst of learning the subject. It's not, I don't mean that to be like you're a total beginner, but I mean that, like, you're still, your mind is still open and searching. Yeah. And so you're absorbing this, and then other people can become part of that process, and then you part of it all together. In a way, that's how I feel like I don't want to ever get to be the kind of the teacher who's just like, well, I'm just doing this again and again and again and again, just the same way I've always done it. There are times in which that can free you up to do other things, but at some level, I do want to be like, oh my God, I just learned about this and I want to share this. And then someone say, well, what about this? And you're like, oh my, that's a great idea. Like, let's explore that too. And, and that process of learning just takes to another level in those acts of teaching and writing.
So have you had these opportunities to teach abroad student, semesters in Rome through Kirkwood?
Yeah. What we've developed is this short-term study abroad, because most of our students are working class students, and the idea of getting away for a semester is usually not an option for them. So we've developed short-term study abroad programs because people like me believe that it's great for people to travel, and it's a wonderful part of one's education to be able to do that. So we have these 2 or 3 week programs, and we've tried to work on ways of subsidizing them so that they're affordable for people to do. And it's been great. I mean,
I've never heard of this offered by a community college.
Yeah, it's great, and it's really transformative for students, as you might imagine. For some, it's their first time ever leaving the state, let alone leaving the country, and so to all of a sudden be in the midst of Rome and seeing all these new possibilities, it's just, one's whole world is expanded.
Okay, so at the risk of embarrassing you a little bit, I want to mention there's a website called ratemyprofessors.com. And, it's an opportunity for students to evaluate their professors on, some of it is about like, this guy's easy, take his class, you just have to do this. And so some of it is like a practical guidance for other students in terms of how to get an easy A, and some of it, so they rank professors on difficulty and various different criteria. But I have a reason behind doing this. So I'm just going to read pieces of 8 different comments that have been made about you, and they're very representative of what I found on this website. And it's going to I'm going to use this as to serve as my next sort of a context for my next question. So some of the things that your students have said about you over the years: hands down, best professor I have ever had. Here's another one. Should be teaching somewhere better. A truly great professor. Another one. He is very funny, intelligent. He should be teaching at a much bigger school. You see a theme running here. Another one here is, it's tough to think of him at a community college because he deserves so much better. I hope he's happy here. Another one, by far the best professor I've ever had. I don't remember the last time I enjoyed a class so much. That might be like the highest compliment I think you can get. And lastly, he is by far my favorite professor of all time. He was knowledgeable, and you can tell he truly loves what he teaches. So take that in, and if you can't take it in at this moment, listen back and take that in. So the question then is, my understanding is that you've been teaching at Kirkland since 2000. Is that correct? And, it begs the question, why? Why have you stayed teaching? Why do you continue teaching at community college? Why have you stayed there? Clearly, you could have pursued opportunities elsewhere. Perhaps opportunities have been offered. I don't know. But, I have my own kind of speculation about this, but I'll just ask, why do you stay at Kirkland?
Well, I absolutely, for the very generous things those students have said, thank you for reading those. It's a little overwhelming, but the, I can say many more nice things about my students. I mean, I've had just really, really wonderful students. And when I first got the job at a community college, I thought, this is just a job. I need to pay the bills, and maybe I'll do something else or move on. But this works out at the time. But I quickly fell in love with teaching at Kirkwood, and the students there, to me, kind of almost reintroduced philosophy to me as I was introducing philosophy to them. In that a lot of them came to this with really serious life questions and saying like, okay, this philosophy business is supposedly about all these big questions. Well, I've got some.
Yeah, help me, Doc.
Yeah, help me out. And, right. And so all of a sudden I was like, wow, this isn't just some academic thing of like, oh, wouldn't it be interesting to think in abstract terms about this? Like, no, this is something I'm going through right now. That I have cancer and I'm, facing my death, and these guys supposedly have something to say about how to face one's death. Like, okay, what do you got? And so for me, it really reminded me of the importance of philosophy and extended my sense of the importance of philosophy to people. And so I really, really, I like, many of my students, but particularly the, what's sometimes called non-traditional students, people who had, gone off and done stuff in life and now are coming back to study for various reasons. They often brought to the table such rich experiences and such a kind of, to me, a really interesting sense of approaching these texts. They may not have always been the people with the highest SAT scores or something, but they often, were able to engage philosophy in as serious a way as anyone, if not more so than most. And so I really loved that part, and I love that part of teaching at a community college. And that's why I've also, loved like volunteering, saying in a prison or doing that kind of stuff. It's just the people bring a lot to bear on these questions, and that's to me what it's all about. So I have, like I said, I've benefited, I think, more from my students than I've been able to benefit any of them. And so yeah, I feel very happy to do that. Now, don't get me wrong, like I'm open to teaching in other environments. But to me, I don't know if I could think of a better environment to be teaching philosophy in than in a place like a community college.
Beautiful. Love that. What are your thoughts on the person you want to be now at this point in your life, at this stage moving forward? Professionally, personally, you can answer that however you wish.
Yeah. I mean, I feel very, what are the great things about philosophy as a pursuit is that, you don't, I feel like you just get better with age, or I'm hoping
Mm.
you just get better with age. Um, uh, uh, like mathematicians, it seems like they do all their greatest work when they're like, 24 or something. But, or chess
The
players, like
Beatles,
it seems like
none
they're
of them
kind of,
had even
yeah,
reached the age of 30 before they split up. So just...
yeah, right. I know. Amazing. Um, and but I feel like when you're a philosopher, it's like, well, for the most part, your glory days are probably in the future, and so I'm looking forward to continuing on with the kinds of things that I'm doing because I love doing them. I do the person I want to be right now that I feel like I've got to really work on as a philosopher is I feel like I want to develop my writing
Mm.
even more. I want to I don't know. I feel like I want to find a I don't know a style that really gets at the thinking itself in philosophy. And I want to kind of just engage with some basic issues even more than I've done. I think I've done a pretty good job of explaining um, philosophers and philosophies and integrating how I've interacted with them. But I guess I kind of want to just get to the some of the thinking and the philosophy itself. But anyway, the point is overall I want to keep developing, as a writer, and then as I do that, I also want to develop as a teacher. I feel like I'm
Mm.
learning even more about how to communicate things effectively and how to get students to be engaged with stuff. So I don't know. So for the most part, it's I feel as if I'm on a path, and I want to just keep seeing how far I can go down that path. Uh, um, and then of course the beauty of philosophy to me as well is that it is a way of life, and so you know I keep thinking about what it means to just to live a good life. A good friend of mine who's a jazz musician and composer actually just died last
Mm.
summer, fairly young, and he had been given a terminal cancer diagnosis and had about a year to live, and
Wow.
lived a little longer, but not too much longer. And I so admired, like, and he was a very kind of philosophical character in his own right, and I so admired how he kind of lived out his last days, that it reminded me too of, like, yeah, I want to live like the kind of example he set, and that to me is what part of what a philosopher can do.
I know you posed that question to your students, the what if you had 1 year to live question.
Hmm.
How did your jazz musician friend choose to live out his last year?
Well, it's I've been thinking about this a lot. I mean, what's really powerful about his name was John Rapson. About him is, so when he first got the diagnosis, he had a bit of the, like, seize the day mentality of like, we're going to go on a big trip, and he and his wife, like, went out and did some stuff. But he said to me, he was like, yeah, I got sick of the seize the day stuff at some point. He's like, I just wanted to get back to work and seeing my friends, and I think what he kind of realized is that because he'd been such a thoughtful person about how he lived, that he was already living a very good life, and he just really just savored it more and more. There's this old Stoic adage that's something like, that sometimes put under an image, and this adage goes, "Let them perish so that I not perish," and it's showing like people on basically on a boat that is in a storm, and they're throwing all the so-called precious cargo overboard to keep the boat alive. And I take it that what the Stoics meant by that was that a lot of what you think is precious is actually not that important, and you can toss that aside, and what you got to get to is what is really important, and keep that close to you. And I feel like that's what he had done. He had found work that he loved. He was a composer and musician, and he was just devoted to that. He was a great teacher who really made a difference in people's lives. He had just a curiosity about almost everyone he met, and he cultivated friendships and had a great sense of humor. And I think that what he kind of realized in the face of death was that he had kind of thrown overboard the things that didn't matter all that much, and he really did have what he needed on his boat, so to speak, and then he just really savored those things. So anyway, that to me is a kind of model of living well that I think can come from someone who has thoughtfully considered what's important and what isn't, and then tries to live it out.
Wow, that's powerful, because I think that it's this thing that it's often presented to us in a hypothetical way. Not many of us have if this term is appropriate, quote, luxury of knowing in advance how much time we have left. So it's one thing to speculate about it, and I think it's tempting when you're doing so to think in bucket list terms of like grand, big experiences. But cutting down, really just sort of like chiseling away everything that is not absolutely fundamentally important. That's really beautiful. I think that's a great way to end this conversation, even though I feel like I could continue for another hour easily. Is there anything that you wish to share with our audience before we close out?
Well, just I want to thank you. I mean, this has just been such a great conversation. You have a real knack for this, and it's just been really wonderful to get to engage in this conversation with you.
Thank you so much. Scott Samuelson, again, is the author of two, what I want to just tell you are excellent books. They're exquisite books: The Deepest Human Life, An Introduction to Philosophy for Everyone, and his second book, 7 Ways of Looking at Pointless Suffering. I can't recommend these enough. He has a third book on the way, which I'm very much looking forward to. And Scott, thank you again so much for your time today and for sharing a little bit of yourself with us on The Person You Want to Be.
Great. Thank you, Eric.